No one ever said you couldn't record a video twice. So we'll see. I'm just off to find the link. Oh, there it is. This is now being taken down by... The article was taken down by LinkedIn. The last video I did this morning has now been taken down by YouTube. Much has been said about coronavirus. I'll be the first to admit I'm not overly sure of the difference between coronavirus and COVID-19, and I'm not sure I need to be. The language being used by the government seems to be ridiculously complex and condescending, and I'm always wary when conflicting stories come into play. Last March or thereabouts, Neil Ferguson, a supposedly reputable scientist employed by a London university, stated that up to 250,000 people could die imminently from this new strain of virus. This was the reason, they said, for lockdown and the various other measures which have been implemented since. This January, in the middle of a review of last year, as is standard programming these days, Neil Ferguson was interviewed by the BBC and stated his prediction of the potential death figures was forecast over 2 years. Roughly last October, Chris Whitty, in one of his nightly forecasts, which I'm sure we all became used to, rolled out the usual figures of doom, none of which over the whole period of a year have ever been correct, incidentally, which was fine until a journalist analysed said figures and reported back that this particular forecast meant 11 million were going to die by Christmas. Needless to say, the same forecast was never broadcast again. In the meantime, tiers became the new lockdown, with the Isle of Wight suddenly jumping from Tier 1 to Tier 4 with absolutely no explanation given by any MP or scientist. Indeed, the rules of the tiers seem to contradict themselves on every level. In one town, you could have a pie and a pint, but across the border, the pubs were closed. In other places, people were cajoled into leaving their personal details to be able to enter pubs, and it wasn't long before women were getting unsolicited phone calls and texts from pub staff asking them if they wanted a date. Then there was the behaviour of the MPs and the scientists themselves. Neil Ferguson popped off to see his married lover shortly after announcing 250,000 of us were about to die a horrible death. Boris Johnson drove 7 miles from his home to go cycling. Boris Johnson's sister toddled off to her second home. Tobias Ellwood held a private party with 27 guests. Dominic Cummings decided to drive up to Yorkshire in a car which apparently didn't need refuelling, nor did anyone in the vehicle need to use services for a trip of approximately 200 miles. He further decided to test his eyesight by driving another 30 miles. Stephen Kinnock, the son of Neil, decided to pop round to see his father. Nicola Sturgeon made a speech in a pub without a face mask and later blocked me on Twitter for asking why she hadn't been prosecuted by Police Scotland. Police Scotland remains silent on the matter to this day. None of these people, in fact, were ever prosecuted or even interviewed under caution by any police force, and yet people have been sent to jail for breaking the very same regulations. And let's look at the virus itself. For a supposedly deadly pandemic which apparently endangered the very existence of the human race, days after the mortality figures started to be read out, numerous people on Twitter started tweeting to the effect of a relative of theirs who had died of cancer or old age or pneumonia had been classified as a COVID death. As I mentioned earlier, though, there were conflicting stories. It was a death involving COVID or related to or within 28 days of a positive test. Now, I'm no scientist, but I've always believed that things to either be or not be in this world. And why is it called SARS-CoV? Many years ago, when SARS was more prominent, a nurse explained to me that we all have SARS, but in levels which ordinarily do us no harm. There was no need for her to lie. We didn't have the 24/7 broadcasting about it like we do coronavirus. We didn't have lockdowns or mask wearing. By the way, if you believe an open weave polyester mask is going to stop a microscopic virus, then I can't help you. Or any of the surrounding chaos that we have now. And so it must be determined we also all have COVID or coronavirus. If you remember November 2019, you're probably now wondering why or how this virus was released from a level 4 security lab in Wuhan. I'm not, it was quite deliberate, and further it was quite deliberately spread by Chinese containers, not one of which was stopped worldwide. In the summer of last year, Maersk, and only Maersk, started putting containers into a storage area down in London Gateway docks for inspection and cleaning, after they'd been brought into the country and their contents delivered. Apart from that, nothing else was ever said, despite flights and ferries being stopped worldwide and isolation procedures being put in place for those who did travel. Of course, according to Matt Hancock, you could still travel if you were on business. More confliction in an arena of confusion. I digress, however. Coronavirus was released deliberately twice, I believe, in November and then again sometime in January 2020. Before you think I'm starting to become all conspiracy theorist, everything I'm saying here I've already said on YouTube or other social media. And I don't believe for a second they wanted to wipe us all out. The whole saga so far has been about control, and largely on a worldwide level. Trump never went for it, which is why he was given the push by voting, which was undoubtedly rigged. It wouldn't have been hard to organise a G20 summit, or even in meetings which the general public knew nothing about. It was Keir Starmer, after all, I think, who admitted to having secret meetings with the EU. Nick Clegg once turned up in Brussels to see Barnier, the only problem being at that time that Clegg had already taken the job with Facebook as communications director. So is it such a stretch to believe quite a number of them know each other and are somewhat more than colleagues? And why lie about the mortality figures, saying if someone had coronavirus then they must have died of it? Why devise coronavirus legislation to bypass post-mortems? And why restrict access to funerals and not allow relatives to visit their family in care homes? There is, you see, as much to be gained by saying restricted access is for your health, as there is of hiding the fact that if access was allowed, then no one would actually get sick and the ruse would be exposed. This is the same reason people were arrested for filming empty hospitals. Since I mentioned hospitals, why were 6 Nightingale hospitals constructed at massive expense to the taxpayer and then used by a total of 35 patients? Briefly. I certainly haven't heard mention of them recently, despite asking Boris Johnson that very question on Twitter earlier this week. I'm afraid to say then, you've all been conned by some very nasty and manipulative minds. There is no doubt COVID-19 takes lives and in quite a nasty way, but not nearly as many as the 24/7 mainstream media broadcasting would have you believe. From the figures I've seen, coronavirus has probably taken about 6,000 lives directly in the UK since last March. And again, you don't have to believe me, but then you don't have to ask yourself any of the questions I've asked here either. All of which have been asked of various MPs and others, predominantly on Twitter, many times by myself and others. Answers came there none. Which is a bit like asking when the end of lockdown will be, including the use of tiers and other restrictions as the government tends to use to avoid calling it lockdown. I predict March 2023, after which a general election will be looming and we will no doubt be inundated with the constant broadcasts of how Boris has saved us all. Until then, keep wearing your bacterial pneumonia-causing face masks and obeying every word Boris says. It won't do you any good. It's been a year after all already, if it hasn't got you by now. Well, and it probably won't. Now, don't forget that's been taken off 2 social networking sites. For what reason? It's no more than a newspaper article.